Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Dunican.
And I'm Kieran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Today we are joined by our most frequent guest, Seamus O'Mahony. Welcome back, Seamus.
Thank you very much, Ian. Good to be back.
It's great to see you again. And I must say, I was on a recent trip to New Zealand for work, and I thought no better book to read on my trip over and back than this. And I sent Kieran actually a picture from my seat of reading this. I have to say, Seamus, I was actually quite surprised and laughed out loud and was horrified at some sections. And I was like, oh my God, reading this book. And most nights when I spoke to my wife, I was saying, do you know what I read today in this book? It to be honest with you, it wasn't the book I expected from you after your last two books.
No, it's a bit of a departure, I agree. And the reaction you describe is the reaction that I was hoping to provoke in the book. So it is a departure. It's a historical narrative. It is tangentially connected to medicine, but not directly in the way that the last three books were. So I came to this subject almost accidentally. I had come across this character, Wilfred Trotter, a few years ago, and I had mentioned him in my third book, The Ministry of Bodies. I was talking about, how rare true polymaths are in medicine, and I cited him as an example of a polymath. And he was a surgeon whose most productive years were the years between the world wars in England. And he was probably the most technically gifted surgeon of that time and of his generation, but also he had written a very famous book called Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War, and kind of coined the term the herd instinct. So he was that rare thing, a surgeon intellectual. But what triggered this book was my discovery that he was the brother-in-law of Ernest Jones. And I had been aware of Ernest Jones going back to my time as a medical student many years ago, because he was Sigmund Freud's first major biographer and, most fervent and closest of his disciples. And
Slash enforcer.
He was the enforcer. And I thought, this is a very interesting connection here. And I looked into this a little bit further, the intersection in the lives of these three men, when I looked into it, was a fascinating one. And the more I read about Trotter, or the more I found out about him, it struck me that here was the perfect pivot to write about psychoanalysis. Now, I had been interested in psychoanalysis for a long time, and I'd written a review of a short biography of Freud by an English psychoanalyst and writer called Adam Phillips. That came out about 10 years ago, and I wrote a review of it for the Dublin Review of Books, and a fairly negative review. But mainly, I expressed in that review my deep skepticism about the entire enterprise of psychoanalysis. And it was always in the back of my mind to write something longer about psychoanalysis. And along came then this connection between these three men, Freud, Trotter, and Jones, and this provided the perfect framework for me to write about it. So I wanted to write about psychoanalysis. I found my framework, but I wanted to write a book that was not full of psychoanalytic jargon, that that fabled person, the intelligent lay reader, could enjoy and be entertained by. And yet, at the same time, I wanted to write something that was scientifically well researched, that was scholarly, but at the same time could be readable and entertaining. So that was what I set out to do with this book. And it's been a departure from my previous efforts. My sources were mainly secondary. I had to read a great deal, far more than for my previous books, for this one. And I also went to look at some original archival material in Cambridge. I was lucky enough to meet Wilfred Trotter's only surviving descendant, David Trotter, who was a very eminent English language academic. He was, until relatively recently, King Edward VII Professor of English Literature at Cambridge. And I contacted him by email, and he very generously allowed me to visit his home in Cambridge and to look through quite a bit of archival material that he had on his grandfather. So I was able to access some primary sources as well for this. So I hope I've written an entertaining and scholarly account of those early years of psychoanalysis. I regard the story as essentially a comic one, even though I have a respect for Freud as an intellectual figure and as a person and as a writer particularly. I view these secondary figures around him as largely comic figures. And I think the story of psychoanalysis is largely a comic story, and I hope that comes across in the book.
I think you succeeded in that attempt, man. I was very surprised as well. Like I picked up the book after having read your previous work, and I was just because and having chatted to you, and I was like, oh, I really enjoyed your writing style without knowing anything about these characters, apart from knowing cursories. I don't really know much about psychoanalysis other than I knew enough to not really be that interested in it, and to kind of, I knew enough to think that there wasn't much there, just in terms of the fact that there was kind of a lot of circular reasoning and circular justifications and, false consciousness kind of stuff. Well, you either, if you don't believe this kind of thing, where if you don't believe that you have these particular drivers, it's because you have repression and you're just unwilling to acknowledge these repressed repressed impulses or desires. And either way, we're right, because if you acknowledge them, we're right. And if you don't acknowledge them, you have repression and we're still right. So that I came across that kind of thing, and I was like, oh, well, this is obviously discardable because, and also I was influenced by Popper as well, and another, in particular, who's his critiques of psychoanalysis and Freud. But I think the comic aspect is definitely stands out on this. Like, some of the absurdities are so like, just like Ian said there about telling his wife, like, I'll be coming back to my fiance and do the same thing. Is like, you won't believe this. Listen to this. And I'm just like reading out some section of some bizarre medical procedure, or like Freud psychoanalyzing his own daughter, talking about masturbation and talking about, the sexual drives. And I was like, oh, this is a strange collection of people doing some really strange things, almost kind of like occultish kind of, or as you described it, kind of a quasi-religious, like it was like an attempt to fill the kind of, the God-shaped hole as it, in the kind of, the post-Christian West, kind of an attempt at a kind of a religious metaphysic to replace Christianity.
Yeah. I mean, it emerged, I mean, it really gained traction, psychoanalysis, after the First World War. There was that kind of vacuum um, where religion appeared to have failed, philosophy appeared to have failed, and into this vacuum came psychoanalysis, which appeared to have an answer for everything, not just, neurosis, but it explained, economics, it explained history, it explained religion, it explained everything. And it came with this kind of very misleading cloak of science. And Freud maintained to his dying day that psychoanalysis was a science. Now, even the most cursory examination of what Freud wrote, it's clear that psychoanalysis was not in any way a science. And what is tragic about it, I think, is that Freud's early experience and early training was in science. It was in neuroscience and in neuroanatomy in particular. The people he attracted had no scientific background. Many of them had no medical training or scientific knowledge or background. Jones was a doctor, but not a particularly skeptical one. So it was a sort of pseudo-rationalistic, all-encompassing system, which had at its heart, as you've alluded to, Ciarán, irrefutability. You couldn't test any of the tenets of psychoanalysis by formal scientific experiment. They were irrefutable. It was a sort of closed hermeneutic system. So in that sense, it was far more akin to religion than science. Wilfred Trotter is important in this book because he personifies, for me, empiricism, science. He is the sort of polar opposite of what psychoanalysis was about. And a key event in the early part of this book is the first International Congress of Psychoanalysis in 1908, which was organized by Jung, who was still part of Freud's inner circle at that time. And Jones and Trotter were then housemates, very close friends. They were yet to be brothers-in-law, but they were incredibly close. At that time, men could enjoy these incredibly close, intimate friendships, which were non-sexual, in a way that doesn't appear to happen nowadays. It's a phenomenon that you see very rarely, this intense friendship between young men. And that is what Jones and Trotter shared. Anyway, they shared lodgings. They were intellectual sparring partners. Trotter was the older by 7 or 8 years. Anyway, they traveled to Salzburg in 1908 to see what all this fuss about this guy Freud from Vienna was all about. So they went. Jones was transfixed by the entire experience. I mean, this was a small congress, perhaps 50 delegates at a hotel. And Freud famously spoke for 5 hours on one case, the Ratman. Jones was transfixed, decided there and then, this is what I'm going to devote the rest of my life to. This is the cause. This is the master. This is what I'm going to do. Trotter, on the other hand, thought this was appalling, and returned to London, tutting about all of this bizarre stuff that went on in Salzburg. And this event was the beginning of the rift that ended that close friendship that between Jones and Trotter. Now, they would remain connected for the rest of their lives because Trotter married Jones's sister, Bessie. But that intense intimacy, that intellectual sparring, that ended in Salzburg when Jones went with psychoanalysis and Potter went with science, with empiricism, with surgery. So when I read deeply into the history of psychoanalysis, not everything, but an awful lot of what I read caused my jaw to drop or my eyes to pop or both. And what's interesting about the standard biographies of Freud and the psychoanalytic literature is enormous. It would fill multiple libraries. The psychoanalytic literature, the commentary on it and the biographies, the eyes are not popping and the jaws are not dropping. And I wondered why. Because what went on was completely bizarre. You alluded to Freud's own analysis of his own daughter, which was borderline incestuous in territory that they covered during that analysis. And then what went on with the Burlingham children, I should mention that Anna Freud's life partner was an American woman called Dorothy Burlingham, who was married into the famous Tiffany family, Tiffany's of New York. She was not married into. She was a Tiffany, and she married a surgeon called Burlingham, and she fled her marriage because her husband had bipolar disorder, and she fled to Vienna with her 4 children and went into analysis with Freud, formed this very intense friendship with Anna Freud. They eventually moved in together and they spent most of their lives living as a couple. They refused to identify as lesbian, but that's what they essentially were. But her children, 2 of them, were essentially ruined by psychoanalysis. They were used as guinea pigs, really, by Anna Freud, the elder 2, Mikey and Mabby. And Mikey drank himself to death, essentially, and Mabby took an overdose in the Freud household in London in the mid-70s and died shortly afterwards. So psychoanalysis was full of, the story of psychoanalysis was full of these casualties. So there was a comic, although the story is predominantly comic, there is also a tragic aspect to this all.
On the science side, this is actually something I think is a fascinating point, is that even though this is related to Freud and then Trotter and then Popper, is that Freud would have been educated in the late 1800s, where there still wasn't really the clean, like I'm quite Popperian in my view of science, and I've been quite influenced by by Karl Popper. But Karl Popper, so Freud would have been educated in the late 1800s, and then Trotter impressed me big time with the self-study he did in 1909 on the nerve experiment, and for 2 different reasons, but in particular his emphasis, and essentially what he ended up with that experiment. He ended up essentially presenting himself as a sort of proto-Popperian in terms of this desire to seek refutation. So and then it wasn't until 1919 that, interestingly, Popper himself had grown up in Vienna, had been exposed to Freud and Alfred Adler, and had been put off by them because of their circular reasoning. And at the time, he himself was a Marxist, and he himself was a Marxist communist. And the same kind of circular reasoning he came across in Adler and Freud, he was also coming across in the communist Marxist friends of his. And then what he got kind of repulsed a little bit by the circular reasoning that they would present in very similar ways between both of those groups of people. And but then he encountered Albert Einstein's attitude toward the 1919 Arthur Eddington expedition to be able to photograph an eclipse. So Einstein in 1915 had presented his field equations, which laid the table for general relativity, to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in 1915. And they largely went there was some mocking and ridicule went on, because they were like, look, who are you to, I know you did some good work 10 years ago, etc., but who are you to really undo Newton? Are you really saying you've just surpassed Newton? And there was kind of some really, it wasn't very taken very seriously. But Arthur Eddington took him seriously and organized this experiment that in 1919 they were going to take a photo. There was one in the same, latitude, one in South America and one in the west coast of Africa, to photograph an eclipse. And what they were looking to see was the distance measured between the eclipse and a particular star, to then see essentially if space-time had bent behind the gravitation of the sun. And what Einstein did in advance of that experiment, which is what impressed Popper, is Einstein explicitly in advance of the experiment presented the conditions that are actually measurable with which he would that his theory would be refuted. So he laid the conditions for the destruction of his own theory, which could actually be done. And that contrast of Einstein's attitude to what Popper was encountering with Adler and Popper and the communists was what illustrated to Popper, oh, that's what science is. This is what makes science science, is the possibility for refutation of a conjecture. And that then laid the kind of table. And that's when Popper went off on his own way. But I think, but 10 years before that, Trotter was already on it in a way that Trotter, this demarcation.
Yeah, Trotter was a Popperian. He was a Popperian before Popper. So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just to go over that, Trotter had read a paper published, I think, about 1906 in the Journal of Physiology, I think, and it was a paper by this pair, Henry Head, who was a neurologist, and W.H.R. Rivers, who was a very interesting figure. He was a sort of combination of many things. He was a psychiatrist and anthropologist. And they were interested in what happens when nerves in human beings are severed and then regenerate or grow again. So Henry Head had several nerves in his arms artificially or surgically severed by a surgical colleague. And every weekend he went up to Cambridge, where Rivers was based, and they documented the process of recovery after the surgical severance of these nerves, because what happens is that the nerves regenerate, sensation gradually returns. So Head and Rivers documented this process over a period of 2 years or more, and came up with this very superficially plausible concept of nerve regeneration and the terms epicritic and protopathic. I won't go into the details because it's quite complicated and it's of interest really only to neurophysiologists. But my point is that Potter read this paper and said, this is all a bit too neat and a bit too plausible. I'm going to repeat the experiment, but I'm actually going to repeat it in a much bigger way. I'm going to have far more nerves severed, upper limb, lower limb, shoulder, and I'm going to do it in two people, myself and my colleague, a guy called Morriston Davies, who was a colleague of UCH at the time. And we're going to do this in far greater detail. And of course, what they discovered is that what happens when a nerve regenerates after being surgically severed is far more complicated than Head and Rivers had made out. And it wasn't this simple protopathic and epicritic. And also what happens when a nerve regenerates after surgical severance is pathological, not physiological. And they wrote up their findings in a very long paper, which essentially completely refuted what Head and Rivers had produced, and concluded that this so-called epicritic protopathic phenomena did not exist, and that you couldn't extrapolate the findings from what happens after you surgically sever a nerve to what happens in normal physiological states. So you couldn't extrapolate those findings. They were completely different phenomena. So this was a classic Popperian refutation of another experiment. Now, as I say, the experiment itself is of very narrow interest to people who are interested in neurophysiology and the pathophysiology of pain in particular. But it was a great example of Popperian refutation. It was a great example of what is still plaguing medicine to this day, the reproducibility or replication crisis.
Yeah.
We've discussed this before.
Yeah.
By that I mean that the vast majority of so-called scientific discoveries are never repeated to see if these findings hold up in a second or third or fourth experiment. Can these original findings be replicated? And that's what Trotter was doing 120 years ago. Now, this was recognized by his peers. He was made a fellow of the Royal Society on the back of this, and he was still a young man when this happened. Now, that's a big deal in science, becoming a fellow of the Royal Society. And it was the only honor that Trotter ever accepted in his entire life. When he saved the life of George V 20 years later, he was offered, a baronetcy and knighthoods and all, turned it down. But the fellowship of the Royal Society was given by was bestowed by your scientific peers, and that was the one honor that he accepted. A famous neurologist called Sir Francis Walsh, writing about this experiment years later, said that Trotter's experiment bore the hallmark of genius because it was a classic. It was one of the earliest examples of a Popperian refutation. So in this book, Trotter stands for that prediction.
He represents that as the contrast in such a fascinating way. Yeah.
Well, that's what I was just going to say, Seamus. Do you think was it intentional by you, or was it just circumstance where these three people, who I kept referring to as the three medical stooges, that's what it reminded me of in sort of this comic kind of way, where everybody had different parts to play. But as you outlined, Trotter being this sort of very, scientific, imperialistic type character, but then Jones, on the other hand, to me was like the polar opposite. Like it was like yin and yang, light and dark. We had Trotter over here, the pinnacle society, and Jones over here, some sort of sex pest. And he kept refuting all this stuff that happened to him. And I was like, this dude is like, I knew guys like in my life growing up that I hung around with that were like, there was a couple of bit of smoke, but this guy had fires following him and kept going, oh, no, I never touched this person. Other people, other staff members, patients. And then on top of that, he was basically having some sort of Ponzi or pyramid scheme where he was training other psychoanalysts to basically go and replicate this so he could make money. And I was like, this is just like completely like chalk and cheese for two people that were so close. Is this?
Yeah. No, I mean,
so surprising.
Well, this is why I thought I have to write a book about this, because the more I read about, I knew a fair bit about Freud, but the more I read about Jones and Trotter, the more astonishing the story became. Not only because Trotter was, I think, that rare phenomenon, and this is very rare in medicine, of a brilliant clinician and a brilliant technical surgeon, but as well as that, a fantastic experimental scientist, a brilliant writer, a very clear thinker on science and medicine. And so he combined a whole lot of things that I admired. And for them to be in one person, I thought was extraordinary. And then on the other hand, you've alluded to Jones, who was essentially a rogue. He was almost certainly had committed sexual crimes. He crossed the boundary many times with patients in terms of sexual relations. But we shouldn't forget that although he was a rogue, and perhaps more than a rogue, probably a criminal in some ways, who was very lucky to get away when he went on trial for sexual offences as a young man, very lucky to get away. He only got off because the testimony of intellectually disabled children was not accepted. However, Jones had incredible energy. He was very intelligent. He was a brilliant organizer. He was an astute politician. He was a very good writer. If you read his biography of Freud, it's excellent. He writes superbly. So Jones was not a fool. Jones was a very able, intelligent man. But he was entirely credulous. He completely lacked skepticism. He was the polar opposite of Trotter. But what dragged me or drew me in was this intense relationship they had, despite being these polar opposites. And I thought this is a fantastic edifice or structure or framework for me to use to write about psychoanalysis. And that's how I came to it. It was serendipitous in many ways. Now, psychoanalysis had been bubbling away in my consciousness for many years as something that I wanted to write about. Now, my background is not in psychiatry or psychology, but I certainly would have read a fair bit over the years about psychoanalysis and was always interested in it as a cultural and social phenomenon, and interested in Freud as a writer. But it was my discovery of Trotter and Jones, and Trotter in particular, that prompted me to sit down and think, this is going to be a book. So that was
you know, with Trotter, sorry, Ian.
I was just going to say, just to close off that, in some way, Seamus, if I didn't know you and I picked up this book, I would have thought maybe it was fiction. Like seriously, I would have thought in some ways this is a story where Freud has been a central, like a kind of a historical fiction book where we've anchored stuff off Freud. But it was at parts where I was like, this is so unbelievable that if I didn't know Seamus, I think this was a historical fiction book. Seriously.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're right. What went on with the secondary characters was extraordinary. I'm talking about, I mentioned Dorothy Burlingham, Princess Marie Bonaparte. What she got up to was, the more I delved into it, I couldn't believe. Is this? It
was
really
layers
true?
upon layers. And
it's just Melanie Klein, who is still regarded with deep reverence by many psychoanalysts. Her life and what she got up to within her own family, analysing her children, and the famous case of Little Richard, which I delved into in some detail, was extraordinary. And then there was this internecine war that took place within the British Psychoanalytical Society in the 1940s. What went on again there was extraordinary. And then you had all of these dilettantes, these Bloomsbury and Cambridge intellectuals who ended up in Vienna in the 1920s, and many of them, like James Strachey, are deeply comic figures. The book is, the tone of it in many ways is comic, interspersed with these episodes of tragedy. But you also have interesting people come into the story, like Archie Cochrane. So Archie Cochrane is regarded by many as the founding father of evidence-based medicine. And Archie Cochrane went into psychoanalysis in the early 1930s himself as a young man. And it was his experience of psychoanalysis that, directly or indirectly, led him to the ideas that eventually became evidence-based medicine. So, the Cochrane collaboration, the Cochrane Foundation, what have you, they're all named after him. So just to tell you the story, Cochrane, like many of the characters in this book, the male characters, had been at Cambridge in the 1920s. And Cochrane was probably gay, he alluded to a sexual problem. And talking to people who knew him, actually, many said to me, well, Cochrane was gay but couldn't accept this. Now, in his memoir, he alluded to a sexual problem, claiming that, in fact, it was the ability to achieve orgasm. And he consulted many doctors, both, sort of regular doctors, if I can use that phrase, and psychiatrists, and eventually decided he would go into psychoanalysis, and traveled to Berlin in the early 1930s, where he went into psychoanalysis with one of Freud's disciples, Theodor Reich. Theodor Reich was one of the early lay analysts. By that I mean he was an analyst who did not have any prior medical training. Freud supported lay analysis because he wanted his own daughter, Anna, who didn't have medical training, to follow him into psychoanalysis. And that was part of the reason why Freud supported this. Anyway, Cochrane went into analysis with Reich. And because Reich was Jewish, he moved, or had to move, when things were hotting up in Berlin in the early 30s with the Nazis. He moved to Vienna. And when things got difficult there, he moved to Leiden in the Netherlands. And every time he moved, Cochrane went with him. So Cochrane was with him for perhaps 3 years and signed on to medical school in both Vienna and Leiden, and eventually sat down with Reich and said, "This isn't working, is it?" And Reich said, "No, it's not. You might as well, go home," which Cochrane did. And Cochrane went back, finished his medical studies at UCH, famously was involved in the Spanish Civil War, was a prisoner of war in the Second World War, and carried out a randomized controlled trial when he was a prisoner of war, extraordinary but true, and eventually became the founding father of evidence-based medicine. But he wrote in his memoir about his experience of psychoanalysis. And he described how he kept asking Reich, his analyst, "But where's the evidence for what you're doing? What actually is the evidence?" He kept banging on to him, "What is your evidence?" And when Cochrane went back to London and finished his training in UCH, he would badger all of these very grand consultants at UCH, University College Hospital, the premier teaching hospital in London, right in the heart of Bloomsbury. He would badger them and say, "Well, what's the evidence for what you're doing?" And the only satisfactory answers I think he got was from Trotter, who was one of the consultants there at the time. So it was his
fascinating lineage.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating.
Yeah. So I was again fascinated when I had written about Cochrane in my second book, Can Medicine Be Cured? I'd written about him in some detail because I thought he was a kind of heroic figure in that he plowed his own furrow within medicine. A lot of people were, poo-pooing. He wrote a great book in the early 70s called Efficiency and Effectiveness, if I think is the word. But it basically was a short book which was the sort of the manual for evidence-based, what came to be called evidence-based medicine in the early 90s. And when I found in his memoir that he too had this fairly prolonged experience of analysis, so he also represents the Popperian empiricist view in the same way that Trotter does. But unlike Trotter, he actually had the full Freudian. He was in analysis for quite a long time. So he finally, and it took him an awful long time to confront Reich, his analyst, to say, look, A, there's no evidence for what you're doing, and B, it hasn't helped me in any way whatsoever, although you're a nice person and I like you. And I thought that was a fascinating episode in the history of evidence-based medicine. So there were all of these strands came together. So I've written a book that as you can imagine, the analysts don't like. It's you know,
or the perverts.
It is incredibly questioning of their and it's mocking, I think, in a way. And I'm not afraid to say that this book mocks psychoanalysis. There have been several critiques of psychoanalysis before mine, done mainly by people who started out as members of this cult. People like Jeffrey Mason and Frederick Cruz were all signed up Freudians, and who came in later to question the entire basis of it and wrote these very bitter accounts. I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. I'm coming from I've never been in analysis. I never believed in psychoanalysis, so I had no faith to lose. And my background is the Popperian one. Trotter is there as represents me in this book, and Archie Cochrane also to a certain extent. So that's my worldview, is that of Cochrane and Trotter. But what I read was astounding, what went on. And my eyes were popping and my jaw was dropping in a way that I had never experienced before when researching a book. And the behavior and the practices of these figures in early psychoanalysis were extraordinary, and I thought needed to be approached in almost a comic way. So when you mentioned that it could be a novel, yes, it could be, but in fact the truth is even more. I've never read fiction where people behave in this bizarre way. So the truth is always more bizarre than fiction. If this were as fiction, it would be dismissed as completely implausible. This could never happen. But
to add a bit of texture to that for any listeners that haven't read it yet, what are your favorite? Like if you were at a dinner party or you were in the pub and you're having a drink and you're like, let me tell you about this. Like, what are some of your favorites?
You won't believe this one. Yeah. What's
you won't believe this one?
You won't believe this one.
I'd have to put Princess Mary Bonaparte up there fairly at the top. So Princess Mary Bonaparte was the great grandniece of Napoleon, the great emperor. And her maternal grandfather was a billionaire. He founded the casino at Monte Carlo. So she was not only royal, she was fabulously wealthy. And she had this dysfunctional early marriage to another royal, Prince George of Greece, and had numerous lovers as a young woman, all right into middle-aged, including the Prime Minister of France, Aristide Briand. She became obsessed with sexual response in women, and she carried out
the surgeries, is it?
Yeah, well, before the surgeries, she persuaded over 100 Parisian women, which I gather were probably friends and acquaintances. And what she had this bizarre theory that there were two varieties of what she called female frigidity, or the inability to experience orgasm, and which she herself suffered from. So this lack of sexual response prompted her to carry out experiments on her friends and acquaintances. And what she did was she measured the distance between the vaginal orifice and the clitoris in over 100 friends and acquaintances, and correlated this with the ability or inability to experience orgasm in the missionary position. And she came up with this theory that women who had a distance of more than 2.5 centimeters between the vaginal orifice and the clitoris were likely to suffer from what she called anatomical frigidity or vaginal frigidity, and that all other causes of frigidity were psychic or psychological in origin. So she went from this to postulate that these women with this particular distance between the vagina and clitoris should undergo surgery to have it shortened. And she persuaded a Viennese gynecologist called Halban to carry out this surgery on her, which she had performed on probably 3 occasions. She and Halban developed this surgical technique by experimenting on what she called fresh corpses, which she obtained from the morgues in Vienna. And she herself underwent this procedure on 3 occasions, carried out by Halban. And I thought nowadays, if a gynecologist was involved in this kind of activity, he or she would not only be struck off, they'd probably be in prison. But that was sort of part of the course at the time. Rich and titled people could persuade doctors to do just about anything in those days. She eventually ended up on Freud's couch as a patient and became an analyst herself. And when she was a practicing analyst in her enormous house outside Paris, she would send her chauffeur to collect the patients and drive them out to her beautiful garden in Saint-Cloud in this outside Paris. And when she went off to Athens or to Saint-Tropez for the summer, her patients came with her and driven by her chauffeur. And I said, I speculated in the book what it must have been like to have been a patient of Princess Marie Bonaparte. Another bizarre episode was Princess Alice of Greece. Now, this is the mother of the late Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And this poor woman had a psychotic episode in the late 1920s. And she had acute psychosis, possibly schizophrenia, possibly a psychotic phase of bipolar disorder, and ended up in a clinic in Berlin, the Tegel Clinic. And the director there was a friend of Freud's and asked Freud for his advice. He traveled down to Vienna by train to ask Freud. Now, Freud never saw this poor woman, but based purely on what this director, Simmel, told him, he advised this bizarre treatment of pelvic radiation as a treatment for this woman's psychosis on the grounds that her symptoms were hyperlibidinal, if you know what I mean. And of course, this didn't work. She ended up in institutional care for several years and eventually became an Orthodox nun in the Greek church, the Greek Orthodox Church. She eventually ended up living with the royal family in Buckingham Palace. But her treatment is another sort of bizarre episode. And then there were all these Cambridge intellectuals who went out to Vienna in the 1920s to be analysed, even though there wasn't anything very much wrong with them, because it was a fashionable thing to do. So, you know, they went to be analysed. Yeah, it was a status symbol. So you went to be analysed, you know, in the 1920s in the way that previous generations went to take the waters, or young aristocrats went on the grand tour in the 18th century. And of course, after the First World War, the Austrian currency was so devalued that English tourists could live very cheaply and very well in grand apartments and undergo analysis for months on end. And the stories of these Cambridge intellectuals is another sort of comic episode. I wrote also about the whole economic structure of psychoanalysis, and I think one of the funniest accounts of that was by an American author called Francis Levy, who had been in analysis for 2 to 3 decades in New York. And his account of his own analysis was published in a psychoanalytic journal called Imago. It's meant to be deadly serious, but if you read between the lines, it's one of the most comic episodes, or one of the most comic papers that I read. He essentially totted up that he had paid over $1 million in fees to his analyst. And he was talking endlessly about his analyst's brownstone house, which was worth $6 million, about his analyst flying first class and on Concorde for holidays to Europe, where he stayed in the George Cinq or the Connaught and all this kind of stuff. And I was fascinated, but didn't go into it in great detail, about psychoanalysis in America in the 40s and 50s, particularly in New York, where it enjoyed this heyday. And people like Janet Malcolm, the great essayist and author, wrote about psychoanalysis, which she had undergone for several years. I think there's another great book, I think, to be written in this comic sort of style about psychoanalysis in America during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when it had this sort of golden age of influence. So yeah, it could have been a comic novel, but it was almost too implausible to be fiction.
Seamus,
on money.
Sorry, Garen,
money, yeah.
On the money side, this is actually a question that I just because you mentioned how much absurd amounts of money were involved in this. And when I look at something like, you look at Trotter and what Trotter presented with this genuinely scientific outlook in terms of a comfort with uncertainty and comfort with transient truths, in terms of just being able to hold an idea, but to be willing to let it go when the evidence changes. And then you contrast that with Jones, obviously, as the kind of enforcer, and Freud as this kind of defender of the psychoanalytic faith, I think, as you described her at one point, and then of course Freud himself. And then I look at that, I wonder, like, how much of, and then there's the absurd amounts of money, and you mentioned in the book as well, I believe at some point, if I remember, about Freud's kind of financial concerns, especially early on. How much of, and then just the psychoanalytic practice, which involved, was it 5 days a week for an hour or something, that it involved, actually that's what you needed to partake in to sign up for a psychoanalytic program. How much of the kind of dogmatism, like you mentioned Jung earlier on, for example, and that one of Jung's books, I don't know, was it like in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, or one of these, I think it was that one, or one of them, he mentioned the kind of his fallout with Freud. And then in Ernest Becker's The Denial of Death, he also mentioned kind of what Jung mentioned, didn't mention the kind of a dogma part, but also mentioned some differentiation in terms of actual practice and how they wanted to go about their practice. But then Ernest Becker explicitly wrote about Jung and Freud parting, because Becker had a whole chapter in The Denial of Death about Freud and used them in a way. And he looked at it from a perspective of Jung and that they parted because Jung was repulsed by the idea that Freud explicitly used the word dogma, as in, we need to make this dogma, like actually use the word dogma. So how much of that quest for certainty or impulse toward enforcing a literal, explicit, dogmatic certainty was financially motivated amongst, and of course you could probably look at different Freudians and a lot different percentages to different ones, but how much of it was a genuine ideological capture or kind of a God-shaped hole or spiritual crisis being filled by this all-encompassing description of everything, and how much of it was, this is an absolutely brilliant way of taking loads of cash off rich people.
Yeah. Well, it was both, I suppose. So, for example, in the 1920s, a lot of Americans came to Vienna. Now, they hoped all of them to be analyzed by Freud, but by the mid-20s, Freud was so famous that they nearly all had to go to second or third choice analysts. But a lot of them went there with one purpose and one purpose only, which was to set up in psychoanalytic practice themselves. Now, Freud opened the floodgates because, and this was one of the few things that he and Jones disagreed about. Jones always advised anybody who came to him asking advice, how do I become a psychoanalyst? Jones always said to them, you have to go and become a doctor first. You have to qualify in medicine and then go off. Freud turned the tables, partly because of Anna Freud, his daughter. And Freud said, no, you don't have to be qualified. He opened the door to what's called lay analysis. And that opened the floodgates. And the only qualification to become a lay analyst was that you had undergone a full analysis yourself. Now, what is a full analysis? You mentioned 5 days a week. Well, it was usually perhaps 3 days a week. Now, a full analysis, what it was, or what was it defined as, changed quite a bit. Early on, it was, 3 days a week, perhaps for a year. But as time went on, it became 2 years, 3 years. And by the 1950s and 60s, many analysts were quite content for some patients, to decide that analysis would only end with the death of either the patient or the analyst. But going back to the 1920s, a lot of these Americans came over, underwent a brief analysis, for example, with someone like Otto Rank. I'm just doing a slight diversion here. Otto Rank was the analyst who was the major influence on Ernest Becker.
That's right, yeah. I was just going to say, as you said, I was just thinking about that, yeah.
Rank broke with Freud in the 1920s over the Oedipus complex, and Rank eventually ended up in America. Now, Rank was very happy to take on these American would-be analysts, do a relatively short, intense analysis for them, and back they went to America and set up as analysts. No, I'm not saying that all analysts were like this, because many more analysts ended up, Jewish analysts in particular, after the Anschluss in Austria, and German analysts after the Second World War, and so on. And many of them ended up in America. But my point was that Otto Rank was happy to do this. He was confronted by Jones, who said, what are you doing? Rank shrugged his shoulders and said, I have to live. So early on, there was this recognition that this was clearly a lucrative business. And when I researched Jones's life, for example, I came across an advert very early on. This was as early as maybe 1918 in one of the London papers from some bogus postal educational company. Do you want to make a fortune as being a psychoanalyst? Pay £2 to this address, and we'll send you all the detail that you need. So early on, there was a recognition that this was clearly lucrative, and psychoanalysts are very sensitive to this criticism that it's only for the well-off. They're incredibly sensitive about this. And they cite the example of a clinic that was set up in Berlin in the 1930s, I think by Karl Abraham, one of Freud's inner circle. And this clinic, for a while, treated impecunious people. And to this day in New York, or certainly into the 1990s, trainee analysts took on people for very small fees or no fees. But the fact remains that if you're to go undergo full analysis, it's a costly experience. And back in the day, in the 1920s, into the 1930s, it was very lucrative. It was so lucrative, for example, that Ernest Jones was able to maintain 4 houses. So he had a Nash Regency terraced house in London. He had a beautiful country house in Sussex. He had a French home on the Riviera in Monton, and he had a cottage in Wales. So he had 4 houses on the go. He was seeing 11 patients a day, and he started off at £1 an hour. And by the time he was into the 1930s, he was up to 3 or 4 guineas an hour, when £1 was a lot of money. So from an economic perspective, psychoanalysis was a lucrative business. I'm not sure that it's quite as lucrative now as it once was, because to live in Paris or New York, or London, sorry, where you have the greatest concentration of psychoanalysts still to this day, these cities are now so expensive that to maintain that kind of lifestyle that Ernest Jones involved, you'd want to be charging, €1,000 a psychoanalytic session, which, you can't get away with. I'm not quite sure what they charge, but it's not that. So it was certainly very, very lucrative. Now, Freud himself wrote quite a bit on the economics of psychoanalysis, what you should charge, how often you should do it, that you should charge for no-shows, that the patient should only take holidays at the same time as the analyst, all this kind of stuff. And Freud, I should say here, was not a greedy man. He actually didn't care he was not motivated by money. He did, however, worry about money a lot. And this goes back to his early life. Freud left academic medicine because he wanted to get married. So Freud left for 2 reasons: because he wanted to get married and he couldn't maintain a wife and a home on the small salary he was earning in academic medicine. And he also left because of anti-Semitism. He was essentially told, I'm sorry, you're clever, but you're a Jew, and you are not going to achieve a professorship in the medical school in Vienna. And that was what prompted Freud to go out into private practice. Now, private practice in neurology in the late 19th century was essentially seeing people who had psychosomatic complaints. And that's how Freud ended up specializing in neurosis and hysteria. And that's how he ended up doing what he did. It was lack of money and anti-Semitism. And throughout his life, Freud agonized over money because he was supporting 6 children, a wife, a sister-in-law, 2 or 3 sisters, all sorts of people. At any one time, he was responsible for up to 12 people. So he wasn't greedy. He wasn't greedy in the way that many other analysts were, but he always worried about money for the reasons that I've pointed out. So ironically, it was worry about money and anti-Semitism that led Sigmund Freud out of academic life. Nowadays, someone like Sigmund Freud would be happily ensconced in a nice apartment in Vienna and would be working his way up towards a chair. Because of the anti-Semitism at the time, he felt he had no choice but to go out on his own and start seeing private patients. And all of these private patients, private neurology was essentially a form of psychiatry or psychology. He was seeing people with hysteria and neurosis.
Seamus, this book, obviously you've delved into all the history of the psychoanalysis, and we've spoken about many different characters, and it's like you could go off many different tangents and write many different books, which I hope you do write more books like this, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And there's been so many crazy things in this book that I'm going to have to read it again, because as you're talking, I'm going, oh yeah, I forgot about that. And as you're talking, I'm remembering it, because that part about the surgery with Bonaparte's grandniece, I read that out to my wife, and she was like that with a cup of tea going, like with her mouth open, like, really? So has this process or this investigation, has it in any way tainted your view of modern day psychology and psychiatry and led to you to be more skeptical of this discipline more holistically?
Oh, quite the contrary. If you look at what has happened in psychiatry over the last several decades, it's very interesting. There's a guy called Joel Paris, who's a Canadian psychiatrist who I've cited him actually in a couple of my books, but he started out as he trained as a Freudian analyst. And he had a sort of moment of epiphany as a young analyst about all of this, where he realized that Karl Popper and Archie Cochrane had far more useful things to say than Sigmund Freud. And he instead went off down the route of evidence-based psychiatry. And psychiatry has mainstream psychiatry has largely abandoned psychoanalysis, largely abandoned it. Which is interesting because not so much in Britain, but in America, from the 50s into the late 60s, psychoanalysis was the most influential school of thought in academic psychiatry. Which is hard to believe now, but that was the case. Academic psychiatry is now essentially no different to any other form of academic medicine. It has to play by the rules. Okay, they break the rules like other branches of medicine. We have the replication crisis, and we have all of these problems that I have written about before, but they essentially subscribe to the empirical Popperian view of science. So within mainstream psychiatry, Freud is regarded as an interesting historical person or figure, but psychoanalysis has been largely discredited and largely abandoned. Now we still have the Institute of Psychoanalysis in London, but most analysts are now, the overwhelming majority are people who work in private practice, who are not part of any academic institution. And the majority of them are not medically qualified. So if you go to an analyst in New York or London or Paris, you will be seeing somebody who probably moonlights as an academic in, gender studies.
So academic.
I'm not saying this in any.
I am. I'll happily say it. I'll happily say it. It's okay.
Yeah.
This show is over.
Yeah. So the contemporary psychoanalysis has been driven down into this kind of cul-de-sac, this ghetto of kind of lay postmodernists who are not part of mainstream psychiatry, and who subscribe to completely different ideas about science, about evidence,
presence of human nature, even the presence of human nature. Like a lot of them, they have these blank slate takes on human nature, that this kind of tabula rasa view on human nature, that everything is a social construct and we're all social constructs and there is no underlying human nature, this kind of thing.
Yeah. So the kind of the key figure there, and I alluded to him briefly in the book, is Jacques Lacan, who 10 minutes. Is the most infamous, I would say, French figure in psychoanalysis. But to this day, there are whole schools of Lacanians who subscribe to Lacan's idea. Now, if you think Jones was a rogue and a rascal, he was in the halfpenny place compared to Jacques Lacan. And I mentioned him briefly in the book. But he kind of established the template for this postmodernist theory-based analyst that we now see today. And Lacan remains an incredibly influential figure, possibly more influential now than Freud, because, as I say, analysis has gone down this postmodernist cul-de-sac. And Lacan is beloved of this kind of person. So France in particular remains a great bastion of psychoanalysis, both within the academy, the literary academy, not the medical academy, the literary postmodernist academy as theory school of thought. So nowadays, psychoanalysis has largely left medicine. The divorce is long over. And the only institutional home that it has is within the postmodernist academy.
There's a fascinating parallel. There's a fascinating parallel on that that you had that I wanted to highlight. That is so, I thought was so interesting, because I've been writing about it a little bit recently, and I've written about it a good bit before, which is, you mentioned a 1921 Ithaca hoax where it was kind of like a fake Freudian. Would you have any more information on that, or any kind of, even just a mile-high description of it?
I only came across this hoax one morning. I subscribed to the London Times online, and I normally glance through it having my breakfast coffee. And one day while I was writing this book, I came across, because the Times publishes little snippets from 100 years ago today or whatever. And one of the little snippets they published was from 1921, I think. So it must have been 100 years ago while I was researching the book 2 years ago. And there was a hoax perpetrated in Ithaca, upstate New York, by some chap claiming to be a Freudian. And he gave a public lecture, and it was stuffed with doctors and academics and all sorts of important people. And he gave this gobbledygook lecture full of Freudian jargon and Romish, which they were all sitting and nodding away. And so even then, 100 years ago, psychoanalysis was already ripe for mockery. So, it was solemn, sanctimonious, full of jargon. I mean, it was absolutely perfect for mockery. So that was one of the earliest episodes of the mockery of psychoanalysis. But it's so mockable that I wouldn't even know where to end. I wrote about Hamlet, and Ernest Jones had written this book about Hamlet and Hamlet and his Oedipus complex, and this was taken so seriously by the sort of theatre people that Laurence Olivier, when he was playing Hamlet in the Old Vic in the 1930s, went to see Jones along with his director Tyrone Guthrie for advice on how he should play Hamlet. And Anthony Daniels, who's a psychiatrist who writes as Theodore Dalrymple, wrote a very funny, mocking piece about this whole concept of non-existent fictional characters having so-called psychological syndromes. So I wouldn't even know where to end with the mockery of psychoanalysis. I fear that I may have completed the mockery. I don't think it's almost beyond mockery at this stage as an endeavor.
But a fascinating echo of that 1921 hoax has happened, interestingly, in the exact fields that you mentioned. It's been that has taken up the mantle, which is the postmodern humanities grievance studies fields. So there was the 1990s SoCal hoax, and then there was the 2018 SoCal squared hoax, which was 3 academics came together and wrote 20 fake papers. And by the time they got caught, 14 had been accepted, 7 had been published, 1 had received an award. And one of the pieces that had been published, basically, they took a chapter from Hitler's Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And what they did was they swapped out the anti-Semitic stuff and put in feminist buzzwords, and it got it got accepted, and it got accepted into a feminist social studies journal called Affiliate. So they basically cracked the code the same way that guy did in 1921, by realizing that basically, as long as you use sufficiently complex jargon and syntax, and that as long as you generally fit the theme of the ideological bias, in this case, it's this oppressor-oppressed narrative, and this kind of intersectional viewpoint where the more oppressed identity characteristics you can accumulate, the higher you go up the status hierarchy. It's like an inverted status hierarchy, which is what this grievance studies thing presents. And that was like, I was like, this is so brilliant, because only in like the next page or the 2 pages later, you mentioned this 1921 hoax. And then like 2 pages later, the next page, you mentioned that this psychoanalysis had been picked up by the postmodernists. And I was like, yes, this is exactly, and it happened again a century later.
Well, it's almost beyond mockery in a way, as I've said, because, for example, Marie Bonaparte, who's an absurd person, completely absurd, and only got away with it because she was so rich and so grand. She is the subject of at least 2 papers, long papers, written by feminist academics, where she is held up as a pioneering feminist icon, and despite the fact that she was, as I say, completely and utterly absurd, and so it's beyond parody, which I think is the problem, and the same with Anna Freud's later career, which influenced child custody significantly in the US. So it's all very well to laugh at psychoanalysis, but there were thousands of casualties.
So much harm. Yeah.
It caused so much harm. It's all very well to laugh at it and say, God, weren't they absurd? Weren't they crazy? But it was worse than that. So I'll just give you the example of Anna Freud's later work. She collaborated with 2 Americans, one a child psychiatrist called Solnit and the other a legal academic called Goldstein. And together they wrote a number of books about childhood and divorce particularly, which ended up influencing the American courts in a major way. Now, I'm simplifying a great deal here, but their argument essentially was that every child has one psychological parent, a dominant psychological force to whom the child goes to for comfort and succor and support. And of course, this was entirely based on Anna's dealings with the Burlingham children, which ended up as a disaster. Now, how this influenced the American courts is as follows. The courts believed this narrative of the one psychological parent, which in most cases turned out to be the mother. So custody after divorce in America was invariably granted by the courts to the mother. Freud, Goldstein, and Solnit in their books discouraged any post-divorce contact between the children and the father. So this whole narrative, which had no evidence base whatsoever, led to suffering on a grand scale in American families. And there's an Irish connection here. Anna Ford and Dorothy Burlingham owned a holiday cottage in Baltimore in West Cork, not very far from where I'm sitting right now. And they went there every summer. And when the 3 Freud, Goldstein, and Solnit wanted to speak with one voice, they came up with this figure which they called Judge Baltimore. Anyway, Judge Baltimore's writings on child custody and the effect of divorce on children caused untold suffering throughout America in the 1980s and 90s. I think the ideas have now been somewhat discredited, but back in the day, they were incredibly influential. So psychoanalytic ideas are not only absurd and comic, but they have caused significant damage to many people over more than 100 years, from all these poor anonymous American children to Prince Philip's mother, to the Burlingham children, to Melanie Klein's own children, to Ernest Jones's children. So there's been a lot of casualties, many, many casualties of psychoanalysis.
I'd contend that it's actually still having an unbelievable effect, even to an increasing degree, just in a different form, and its new mutated form is the postmodern theory-based grievance studies, humanities, pseudo-academia being rammed into STEM fields and medicine, which is taking place. So, for example, like this stuff around the gender, the bizarre gender stuff that's now actually in the Irish education system as of last month, which is that it's essentially stuff that's the kind of thing where they use an infographic called the genderbread person to suggest that a child can identify as a boy or a girl or neither or both. And part of that on the medical side is a fast tracking, a social and medical facilitation, and even fast tracking and incentivization toward irreversible medical interventions for children with forms of gender dysphoria. So that would then result in like chemical sterilization, hormonal destruction, osteoporosis, and then actual surgical interventions. Like you were mentioning Bonaparte. And the horrific thing is I read an essay recently about that outlined a machine that they're after developing in a University of Oregon hospital that specializes in turning penises into vaginas. And they use this big machine that sounds like something out of a horror movie. And they've been doing it. And the absolutely crazy thing is they've been doing it to minors as well, who have dysphoric situations going on. And then that's just on the gender side. So it's actually the same ideas, but they're now just mutated, got a new form. They're wrapped in this social justice sentiment. You actually used the phrase social justice at one point as well, in relation to these ideas, and after writing about Lacan. And then you even have this DEI stuff, diversity, equity, inclusion, which has on the surface sounds really nice, but then in its actual implementation ends up in quite horrific outcomes. An actual practical example being during the COVID pandemic in New York State, there was policies in place in certain hospitals, if not the state itself, one or the other, that pushed white people down the hierarchy of treatment because it was seen as justified because of past oppressions against people of color. And that there was actually like a literal, like there was a hierarchy in place in the hospital. It was like the HR department in the hospital implementing policies. This is after the George Floyd stuff and the kind of racial stuff really blew up in the US. But it's the same. It's actually, and even though you think, well, what has race and gender to do with each other? Well, what it essentially, what ties them both together is the social justice aspect rooted in this kind of postmodern theory-based view of the part of the humanities that views things through an intersectional lens that looks to accumulate essentially victim points, so that, let's say, people like us, who would be white male educated, like whatever would be like farther up the dominance hierarchy. Therefore, we're actually we're actually the least valuable as a result of having these less oppressive points. And I think that I can't help but think that hopefully it's not a century's time, but I think that just like you wrote this book about the absurdities of psychoanalysis, I think that hopefully it won't go on so long. There already are some books about it, but I can't help but think that this is that what's happening now in medicine and STEM, and like you mentioned the Royal Society, I've got loads of notes. You mentioned the Royal Society. I know I'm bombarding information, but I spent, as Ian will attest, I spent years thinking about this and writing about this and reading about this. But the Royal Society of Chemistry, so not necessarily just the Royal Society at large, but the specific Royal Society of Chemistry was maybe late last year, I think, published guidelines to their editors that basically said, and that we don't want to publish things that might offend our readers or people of color or whatever, where they're basically, this stuff is actually getting into STEM, like hard STEM fields. And there was a university professor, Anna Krylov is her name, in the University of Southern California, I think, who's basically who wrote some really good work on this and pointed out some of the, essentially, she came from the Soviet Union, and she basically has been raising the alarm since mid-2021 with an essay she wrote that was published in the Journal of Physical Chemistry Letters called The Perils of Politicizing Science. And what she was essentially pointing out was that these bizarre grievance studies, humanities, essentially quasi-religious views, are making their way into STEM and actually impacting hiring practices, impacting publication, impacting biases of journals, impacting, and then she didn't even mention medicine, but the impact in the medical world or the medical side of STEM or part of STEM is also being impacted as well by this stuff, particularly in North America. But it's sort of like, America sneezes and we catch a cold as well. So it's I couldn't help, as I was reading her book, I was like, there's parallels to this or echoes of this happening today to a startling degree.
Well, it's interesting that, and it's more than interesting, it's one of the delicious ironies that psychoanalysis or psychoanalytic theory has become enmeshed in this modern kind of post-Marxist academic endeavor that you describe, where social, which frets about social justice. And somehow psychoanalysis is getting a bit of a reboot inside in that particular world. And the irony,
because it's not falsifiable.
And the irony, of course, is that this was a treatment, and I'm saying that with inverted commas around it, that was available only to incredibly privileged people, psychoanalysis itself. The people who can avail of a full analysis are very rich, privileged people. And yet, psychoanalytic theory is one of the important pillars of this way of thinking, which is extraordinary. And they even talked about, in France in the 1970s, the Freudo-Marxists, as if somehow, the rising up of the proletariat was somehow connected with wealthy, privileged people lying on a couch telling an analyst about their dreams, or somehow connected. So again, it's beyond parody, beyond mockery.
The parallel in that, though, with the Freud and the Marxists is that, whereas, like I used the example earlier on of if you're chatting to someone who actually, let's say, buys this stuff, or let's say if you were to try and use their argument, it's like, if you don't accept these Oedipal complex or castration complex or whatever, then you have repression. And if you do accept it, so either way, we're right. The Marxist equivalent of that is eventually the proletariat will realize the oppressive situation that they're in, and then they would throw off their shackles and overtake the bourgeois capitalists, etc., and then they'll take over society. And if they don't do it, it's because they've been brainwashed with false consciousness into believing that there is no other way of doing things. So either way, they're right. And it's the lack of falsifiability and the establishment of a kind of a virtue signaling that doesn't actually require doing any actual good. It's like a stance that takes, well, I'm more virtuous than you because I've done my analysis, or I'm more virtuous than you because I talk about wanting good stuff for the quote unquote proletariat without actually doing anything for them.
There's a great book by a philosopher called Ernest Gellner about psychoanalysis, a critique of it. And his central theme was that irrefutability is at the heart of it, as you've described. Yeah. It is built into psychoanalysis, irrefutability. So it can't be critiqued, and it cannot be refuted because irrefutability is built into it. So it's almost like it's like Popper and Freud are the Christ and the Antichrist of this way of thinking. And
there's a book, Seamus.
So getting back to where I started, I suppose Trotter represents the Popperian empiricist tradition, who understands that at the heart of science there's doubt. That's the core of science. It's doubt. And that's what we keep forgetting. And that's what really worries me about contemporary science, particularly medical science, is the absence of doubt. The rarity of people saying, I don't know, I'm not sure, it might be. They've all become advertisers for themselves and boosterists. And I think we miss that kind of figure like Trotter, who was the first person to hold his hand up and say, I really don't know, I'm not sure. Perhaps we should do another experiment and see if that really holds up. And I think we're in danger of losing that doubt, which is at the very, very core of science. So that's why he was so attractive for me as a figure to write about, because he stood for everything that Freud didn't. And yet I'm kind of attracted to Freud in some ways, because although I profoundly disagree with the entire edifice of psychoanalysis, as a person, he was a person of not only charisma, but also of a sort of an unusual type of personal integrity, which many of his followers did not have. And he was also a great prose writer. I think Freud might have led a very obscure life as a Viennese academic had it not been for the circumstances that I described earlier on. And he might have been, admired by a small esoteric audience of academics, because he wrote very well on things like myth and history and various other things. He wrote very well on those things. But I think he created this monstrous edifice, which caused, I think, profound sort of ripples culturally, and still does to this day. So he's an interesting
another parallel to Karl Marx.
Yeah, that's right. Another great, yes, another great Jewish life. Yeah. And they share many, similarities. There's a sort of rabbinical quality to both of them that is not entirely accidental, but yet there are many parallels indeed. So for me, it was a personal book in some ways, because I wanted to make the case for Trotter's tradition over what Freud's were. I wanted to make that case and to argue that Trotter may be an obscure figure historically compared to Freud, but he is everything that I believe science and medicine in particular should be aiming for.
Yeah.
And I
Preaching
think
to the choir here, Seamus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that came across very well. I think that's about all we have time for today, but that's brilliant, Seamus. I could sit here listening to these stories for days. I actually, as you were talking, I was thinking maybe I should do maybe you can get a deal with BBC as some sort of like a medical history podcast. It would absolutely be fascinating. But for anybody who wants to buy the book, it's here on screen: The Guru, The Bagman and the Sceptic, a story of science, sex and psychoanalysis by Seamus O'Mahony. So thank you very much, Seamus, for coming on. We will put the link to this book in the show notes. If you're looking to get somebody a Christmas present, you're only about 9 or 10 weeks out from Christmas, and you want someone to chuckle and a great read over Christmas, this is, I highly recommend it. I'm actually going to read this again, because I think through my first reading, my jaw was dropping so much that I forgot. And I was like, so I'm going to go back. I got lots of notes made, and I'm going to go back over it again. But it's an absolute fantastic read, and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was great for a plane journey over and back to New Zealand. So thanks again, Seamus, for coming on. It's always great to have you on. I always learn something from these conversations. And I feel like we could sit around a fire till dawn, having these chats. They're absolutely brilliant. They enliven me so much. So thanks very much.